And former Congressman Bill Owens is here with us now. Good to see you. Welcome back.
Good to see you, Tom.
You were at the welcome ceremony at the White House last week
I
for
was.
the Prime Minister.
The opening ceremony, very impressive.
Mr. Trudeau really got the star treatment.
He did. And I think that, he's a young guy. He's a real significant change in government in Canada, philosophically. I think they were really trying to rekindle the relationship that's been a little damaged over the last couple of years.
Been kind of frosty the past few years. Mr. Harper and Mr. Obama weren't exactly the warmest of friends.
No, that would be an understatement. And some of that's by nature of their personalities. I think Trudeau is a more outgoing, friendly person, and I think that was what was needed.
And they seem comfortable with one another. They were joking about who's more superior when it comes to hockey and beer.
Right.
When it comes down to issues, they talked about a number of agreements reached on trade, on the border, on climate change. Was there any pressing issue you think that they had to talk about, whether it's the war in Syria, ISIS, Al-Qaeda?
From what my sense of the conversations were, and I had dinner that night with several of his senior staffers, and clearly they were really focused on the U.S.-Canada relationship, the pre-clearance agreement. There's legislation in Congress now to pass that. There is not legislation yet in Canada to implement that agreement. They talked a little bit about the softwood lumber issue, not so relevant to where we live, but a big deal for Western Canada.
It's been a thorny issue for a number of years.
For 20 years. And so they were really working to, I think, unthaw the relationship in the arena that we normally do, which is trade.
The pre-clearance, where does that stand now?
Both countries need enabling legislation. We have the enabling legislation in the United States. It's been introduced in the House and the Senate. As I said, in Parliament, it has not been introduced yet. The big difference being, in Parliament, if Trudeau gets behind it, because they have a majority, they can simply pass it with little or no resistance. On our side, we still have to find a bill to attach it to, I think, in order to get it passed this year.
Is that likely to happen, something like this? Do you think there's any real opposition to doing this?
There is an opposition, at least that I've heard, but there is a lack of understanding of the importance of it in terms of trade and the U.S.-Canada border.
What is the importance of having customs officers at Central Station in Montreal? How would that benefit tourism and having the train not have to stop at the border? How big of a deal is that?
Well, they estimate it's about a 2-hour stop now, because we don't have pre-clearance. So you take 2 hours off that train trip, makes it more inviting for people to utilize that service.
So this would expand beyond trains, and it would include busloads of tourists coming into the U.S. Part of this would also allow customs officers from Canada to be on the Messina end of the international bridge to set up custom facilities there. Also, when you were in office, a big issue for you was the sharing of border facilities. And you pointed to Churubusco, where the U.S. invested millions in upgrading its facility. Canada, just a few feet away, closed its border facility. So there you have a beautiful new facility, but people wanting to get into Canada have to either go to Chateauguay or over to Moores. And you've always thought that it would make sense to share facilities.
And I still do. I think that would make a great deal of sense. Really the Messina concept is a shared facility. If you did that in Churubusco, you could reopen that facility.
During Mr. Trudeau's visit, do you think there was any talk of Keystone XL, or is that settled for now? Will I have to wait for the next president?
My suspicion is that Keystone was probably talked about, much like I'm sure Syria was talked about and ISIS was talked about. But those kinds of discussions, I can understand why they might not have made them public.
While he was in D.C., Mr. Trudeau also met with some members of Congress.
Yes.
Was that important? Was that strategically important for him? Because obviously Mr. Obama is only in office for another 10 months. And was he laying the groundwork with members of Congress who he may have to deal with over the next several years?
Well, during my time in Congress, one of the questions that was always asked by the Canadian ambassador, then Gary Doer, was how do we make a larger impression on members of Congress about the importance of the U.S.-Canada relationship? Their feeling was that many members of Congress weren't aware. And I suggested to them, I was asked a couple of months ago when they told me that Mr. Trudeau was coming down, what would I suggest? And I said, meet a couple of members of Congress. Make sure you do that so those folks have a connection, a personal connection to you. And they did it, and I think it was an incredibly smart, strategic decision.
Canada's economy is showing some signs of improving. It's been a rough go for a while.
It's a significantly difficult period, all really tied to the downturn in the price of oil. That was what was driving the Canadian economy, and it is a resource-based economy, resource and export-based economy. So when you take those pieces, it's not a surprise that their economy took a downturn. What's really surprising to me is it wasn't worse. You know, you didn't see a collapse in housing, you didn't see a larger collapse in their stock market. The loonie is starting to rebound now. It's up 8 or 9 percentage points. I think we'll see it continue to creep up. I don't think it gets much above 80 for a while, but even that's a significant difference and will benefit our community.
Can Mr. Trudeau take any credit, he or his policies, for the rebound of the economy?
I think that because he announced very quickly that he was going to do major infrastructure investment, major investment in education. Monsieur Couillard was also making similar announcements. I think people saw that as a stimulus, and therefore a strengthening of the dollar occurred.
You mentioned the Premier of Quebec. You met with him recently. What were some of the issues that the two of you discussed as far as keeping the trade going between Quebec and New York?
Well, the principal message he wanted to deliver was that the province of Quebec is open for business. They're interested in exporting into the United States. They're interested in having investment from the United States, but that they're open for business, and this is going to be a stable, business-orientated government.
Let's talk about President Obama's trip to Cuba coming up in just a few days. He's heading down there, a continuing thawing of relations between the two countries, going to relax travel restrictions even more. Commercial flights will be starting up either late this summer or sometime in the fall, and Plattsburgh is actually hoping to get in on that, hoping to lure a carrier or multiple carriers here to offer flights to Cuba for Canadians who often fly there for vacation. Could this be an economic boon for the airport in Plattsburgh?
I certainly, you know, Canadians have been going to Cuba really forever because they did not have an embargo. And if you had a Canadian passport, you could go to Cuba without any difficulty. I think it could be a huge boon if we can get in here a carrier or two who will fly people to Cuba from our region, obviously mostly Canadians. I think it could be a huge boon, and you don't also know what kind of other economic benefits could come out of that in terms of commercial, as opposed to just, if you will, the tourism end of the business. That's what we all think about. But I think there's other opportunities that we may be able to become a center for the shipment of product to Cuba out of the coming from Canada to Plattsburgh and then into Cuba.
Let's talk a little politics.
Okay.
You're watching, like the rest of us, the presidential race. What do you make, especially on the Republican side, of Donald Trump's success?
Well, you know, I think that to a large extent, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders tapped into the same disquiet that people feel, obviously, on different spectrums of politics. But, you know, there were people during the New Hampshire primary who were saying they couldn't decide between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders that they were going to vote for. And when I first heard that, I was a little bit surprised, would be a nice word, that people would be torn in that way. But it is the angst that I think grows out of a couple of issues. One is the economy, the stagnant wages that we've experienced for a very long time. There's concern about these various free trade agreements, you know, TPP and TTIP with Europe. All of those things, I think, create a real disquiet in the community, and particularly for people who are, let's say, over 50. They've experienced this loss of jobs, whether it's directly related to these agreements or not. I think is open to some question. They've certainly had stagnated wages, and they're expressing that. So in that sense, not a surprise. Now, the behavior that you see on some of the Republican debates is mind-boggling to me. How someone could vote for an individual who purported themselves in that way for president, I just simply find mind-boggling.
Is he qualified to be president?
Sure. I think he's got the intellectual capacity. He's got the experience. The fact that he was not a politician, I don't think is a real negative. It depends upon whom he surrounds himself with. If he brings in a strong vice president who has good congressional connections, if he brings in members of his cabinet who have similarly strong connections, he can govern if he's prepared to move towards the center, as really virtually everyone has had to do in the last, 20 years, 30 years.